China has proposed a new national security law that could have drastic impact on the way people live in Hong Kong. It's part of Beijing's response to those massive protests that swept through the city last year. Ramy Inocencio has more.
Communist leaders convened in Beijing for China's annual Congress and immediately zeroed in on their target, Hong Kong. We will stop violence and restore order, Chairman Wang Yang announced, suggesting the autonomy Hong Kong enjoys under one country, two systems was no longer on the table. It's scenes like this that China plans to subvert anti-government protests led by what they describe as terrorists and a threat to national security. The Communist Party has now revealed a controversial plan to bring Hong Kong to heel, banning treason, secession, and subversion. The announcement comes as protesters readied for another summer of discontent. On Mother's Day, riot police chased pro-democracy flash mobs, calling for Hong Kong's unpopular chief executive, Carrie Lam, to resign. Last month, police arrested 15 of the city's top pro-democracy icons, from politicians to lawyers and activists.
Technically, there's just nothing we can do to challenge it, because it's your mother's order.
All right, Ramy, we covered the protests in Hong Kong a lot, and then it seemed to have at least faded from the headlines here. Obviously, coronavirus has sort of taken the lion's share of the coverage, and I actually really wondered what had happened to the protests, if they had fizzled out or not. So my question is a little bit twofold. It is, what happened to those protests? How did they sort of wind down, or did they wind down? And then what does this new security law proposal mean for life for people in Hong Kong?
Sure, Anne-Marie. In a word, coronavirus happened to Hong Kong as well as to the rest of the world, and that really basically trumped any kind of political desire to hit the streets. But of course, now that we're seeing that Hong Kong has pretty much tamped down its own epidemic, its own situation there, we're already starting to see some of this tension simmer back up to the public view. Case in point, over the past 2, 3, 4 weeks or so, we've seen scuffles between politicians in the legislature, and then even just today, we have seen a couple several people protesting on the streets today, but it still hasn't been a lot in terms of how this possibly could impact Hong Kong. It depends on who you ask, really. If you ask people who support this proposal, support this national security legislation, let's say if you follow the law, then your life won't change. For example, Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, she came out with a written statement earlier saying that only if you wanted to do treasonous acts, only if you wanted to collude with foreign interference, only if you wanted to, say, do specific things like burn the flag of Hong Kong or of China, then you would be in trouble. But by implication, if you didn't do any of that, then you would be okay. With regards to people enjoying freedom of expression, freedom of the press, there's been talk that people could self-censor themselves. But of course, over the past few decades, Hong Kong has really enjoyed a sense of, I guess some might say entitlement, but especially freedom that they can say things that they want, which their compatriots in mainland China definitely don't have.
Ramy, so let's dig into this. What are you hearing from sources in Hong Kong, analysts, about why China is choosing to do this now? It does strike me that in the first go-around, they, for whatever reason, refrained from using military or even language that seemingly suggested that they were going to use military channels or otherwise to bring Hong Kong to boot. Now, the reason I ask that is because the President of the United States has been very vocal about the coronavirus and its origins with China. And you can see the President and his supporters and others using China as a way to deflect from what is happening in this country. What the President has not done is, this administration over the last couple of years has not been one to go out on a limb when it comes to human rights in countries that abuse them, like China. So I'm wondering why Beijing is choosing this moment, this go-around, to exert its muscle.
Sure. Similar to Anne-Marie's question, coronavirus is the answer. The fact that countries around the world, the United States itself in particular, is still focused on the pandemic now is a good time, a good opportunity for Beijing to say, listen, while the world is looking at other things, now is a time for us to make something happen that we've wanted to happen for a very long time. A little bit of history on this. By the mini constitution that governs Hong Kong, they're actually supposed to put forward legislation for national security. They tried to do that back in 2003, but there was a massive street protest at that time. 500,000 people hit the streets then. So that was shelved 17 years later in part because of the protests that happened last year and because the world has its attention shifted away. Beijing at the National People's Congress now is saying, now is the time to do this. In addition, President Xi Jinping is the strongest leader of China in decades. And so he wants to do this under his watch to bring Hong Kong into the fold as much as possible. And we're also seeing outreach, both positive as well as negative, to try to bring Taiwan into the Greater China umbrella.
And certainly, Ramy, that is the risk, right? As this continues, as the United States and other countries focus on the pandemic, which they rightly should do, you get authoritarian regimes like China trying to exert their influence, in some cases in ways that, under normal circumstances, most democratic countries would not be in support of. And given the fact that this president has generally looked the other way as countries abuse their own citizens, like in the case of Afghanistan, for example, and Jamal Khashoggi, this is certainly an opportunity that Xi Jinping sees to seize the moment. We really appreciate your reporting, Ramy, as always. Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.